Podcast 6 of the Thorax series, the heart and its pericardium. I'll start by detailing the pericardium and then look at the anatomy of the heart, focusing on the features of its external surface and its chambers. So the pericardium is comprised of two layers, a fibrous pericardium and a serous pericardium. The fibrous pericardium is a dense sac made up of connective tissue that surrounds the heart and parts of the great vessels. It has a broad base which is continuous with the central tendon of the diaphragm, and this forms the cardiophrenic ligament. Superiorly, the fibrous sac is continuous with the adventitia of the aorta, the pulmonary trunk, and superior vena cava. Laterally, it is covered by the mediastinal portions of the parietal pleura, and posteriorly, it covers the pulmonary veins. Lining the underside of the fibrous pericardium is the serous pericardium, which is similar to the pleura and has two layers. These are known as the parietal pericardium and the visceral pericardium. These two layers of serous pericardium are arranged in a similar manner as the pleura in the thorax. This means that lining the inside of the fibrous pericardium is the parietal pericardium, and tightly covering the heart itself is the visceral pericardium. Between these two layers is a thin film of serous fluid that allows the heart to beat freely within the pericardial sac and limits friction between these two layers. The pericardium is an important structure that anchors the heart in the middle mediastinum and prevents overfilling of the ventricles. A collection of fluid within the pericardium can compress the ventricles and prevent them from filling, and therefore limit the volume of ejected blood. This is known as cardiac tamponade, and I'll discuss this in greater detail in podcast 10 when I detail some clinical considerations involving the thorax and its organs. So now let's turn to the anatomy of the heart, and I'll start with some general features and then detail the heart's external surface and its boundaries within the thorax. To finish the podcast, I'll examine the individual features of the heart's four chambers and the valves which guard them. So the heart is a midline, cone-shaped muscular organ that is roughly the size of a clenched fist and is anchored in the middle mediastinum directly behind the sternum and contains four chambers, the two atria and the two ventricles, which together form two pumps. The right atria and right ventricle receive deoxygenated blood from the superior and inferior vena cava and pump it to the lungs via the pulmonary trunk, and this is known as the pulmonary system. The left atria and left ventricle receive oxygenated blood from the lungs via the pulmonary veins and distributes it to the rest of the body via the aorta as the systemic system. Separating the two atria from the two ventricles is the fibrous skeleton of the heart. This is a dense collagenous structure that forms four fibrous rings that surround the orifices of the heart's four valves. It has four important functions. Firstly, it keeps the orifices of the heart's valves patent during contraction. Secondly, it provides the attachment of the valve's cusps. Thirdly, it provides attachment for the myocardium. And fourthly, it forms an electrical insulator that separates the two atria from the two ventricles. This allows the atria and ventricles to contract independently, and it also provides a pathway for the AV bundle to reach the ventricles. So now let's turn to the external features of the heart. The heart has three surfaces: a base, an anterior surface, and an inferior or diaphragmatic surface. And it also has three distinct borders: a left, a right, and an inferior border. But let's look at the surfaces first. The base of the heart is its posterior surface, and this is mainly formed by the left atrium, which receives the four pulmonary veins. It is also formed by a small part of the right atrium and has the esophagus and thoracic aorta directly behind it. The anterior surface is formed mainly by the right ventricle, part of the right atrium, and the right auricle. It is also formed by a narrow strip of the left ventricle on its left side and the left auricle. The inferior or diaphragmatic surface sits on the diaphragm and is formed mainly by the right ventricle and part of the left ventricle. So now let's look at the borders of the heart. The right border is formed by the right atrium and runs between the 3rd and 6th costal cartilages, 2 centimeters to the right of the midline. From the 6th costal cartilage, the inferior border runs horizontally to the left as far as the midclavicular line and is formed by both the right atrium and right ventricle. At the left extremity of the inferior border is the heart's apex, and this is formed mainly by the left ventricle. From here, the left border runs superiorly and slightly medially up to the 2nd intercostal space, 3 centimeters to the left of the midline, and is formed by the left ventricle and the left auricle. Okay, so now let's turn to detail the features of the heart's 4 chambers. To do this, I will go through the chambers of the heart in the same order that deoxygenated blood returning to the heart would. So that's from the right atrium to the right ventricle and to the lungs. Then from the lungs to the left atrium, the left ventricle, and finally to the aorta. So let's start with the right atrium. Internally, the right atrium has a smooth posterior wall, the sinus venarum, and this contains openings for the superior vena cava superiorly and the inferior vena cava inferiorly. There is also a small opening for the coronary sinus. The anterior wall of the right atrium is rough and contains a series of muscular ridges called musculi pectinati. These muscular ridges are separated from the smooth sinus venarum of the posterior wall by a vertically orientated ridge. This is the crista terminalis. These rough and smooth parts can also be separated externally by a shallow groove, and this is the sulcus terminalis. So the right atrium has a smooth posterior wall, the sinus venarum, a rough anterior wall, the musculi pectinati, and these parts are separated internally by the crista terminalis and externally by the sulcus terminalis. The right and left atria are separated by the interatrial septa, which is an oval-shaped depression, approximately thumb size. This is the fossa ovalis, which is a remnant of the foramen ovale, which allowed blood from the placenta to bypass the right ventricle and the lungs and directly enter the left ventricle for distribution to the rest of the developing fetus. Also running towards the foramen ovale in the developing fetus was the inferior vena cava valve, and this directed blood entering the right atria from the inferior vena cava towards the fossa ovalis, and in the adult this is just a small fold near the opening of the inferior vena cava. 2 specialized groups of cells, the senoatrial and atrioventricular nodes, are both located within the right atrium. The senoatrial node, or the SA node, is located at the junction of the superior vena cava and the right atrium, near the superior end of the sulcus terminalis. The atrioventricular node, or the AV node, is located on the postero-inferior aspect of the interatrial wall, near the opening of the coronary sinus. So now let's turn to the right ventricle. The right ventricle is separated from the right atrium by the right atrioventricular orifice. This orifice is stabilized by the fibrous ring that separates the atria from the ventricles and is guarded by the tricuspid valve. The tricuspid valve has 3 cusps, the anterior, septal and posterior cusps. The wall of the right ventricle is about 3 to 5 millimeters thick and has muscular elevations called trabeculae carni. Amongst the trabeculated wall are 3 papillary muscles, an anterior, a septal, and a posterior papillary muscle. These attach to the 3 cusps of the tricuspid valve by sending fibrous chordae tendinae. These fibrous cords are important in preventing the cusps of the tricuspid valve from everting back into the right atria when blood is ejected from the right ventricle towards the pulmonary trunk. To prevent the blood being ejected back into the right atria with right ventricular contraction, the papillary muscles contract and keep the chordae tendineae taut. This prevents the cusps everting back into the right atria. An important feature of the septal wall is the septomarginal trabeculae, or the moderator band, and this band of muscle connects the interventricular septum to the anterior papillary muscle and provides a shortcut for the right bundle branch to coordinate the contraction of the anterior papillary muscle. At the entrance to the pulmonary trunk, the ventricular wall is smooth and does not contain the muscular elevations, and this region is the conus arteriosus. This smoothened portion is separated from the roughened muscular part by a thick muscular ridge, the supraventricular crest. Superior to the conus arteriosus is the pulmonary valve, and this leads on to the pulmonary trunk, which divides into the left and right pulmonary arteries. Contraction of the right ventricle forces blood through the pulmonary valve and into the pulmonary trunk, taking deoxygenated blood to the lungs. Notice that these pulmonary arteries are taking deoxygenated blood and not oxygenated blood. Now let's turn to the left atrium. Oxygenated blood returns to the left atrium via the 4 pulmonary veins, and these drain into its posterior wall. The left atrium has a mostly smooth wall, except for its auricle, which contains some musculi pectinati. The interatrial wall, which separates the left atrium from the right atrium, also exhibits a remnant of the foramen ovale. Here a shallow depression represents the left side of the fossa ovalis. The left atrium is connected to the left ventricle by the left atrioventricular orifice, which is again supported by the fibrous ring, which provides the attachment for the bicuspid valve. The bicuspid valve has 2 cusps, the anterior and posterior, and is sometimes referred to as the mitral valve. So finally, let's now turn to the left ventricle. The left ventricle is the largest chamber of the heart and forms its apex. Its ventricular wall is much thicker than the right, at about 1 centimetre, and also contains elevations, which are the trabecular carni. Similar to the right ventricle, the left ventricle has papillary muscles, but as the bicuspid valve only has 2 cusps, there is only the anterior and posterior papillary muscles, and these also attach to the valve's cusps via chordae tendineae, which again prevent eversion. The left ventricular wall is smoothened at the entrance to the aorta, and this is the aortic vestibule. As blood is ejected from the left ventricle, it passes the aortic vestibule and enters into the aorta by going through the aortic valve. The aortic valve is similar in structure to the pulmonary valve, and I didn't mention the pulmonary valve in any detail earlier in the podcast when we looked at the right ventricle. So let's detail these 2 valves together. Both the pulmonary and the aortic valves are described as semi-lunar valves. They both contain 3 cusps, which are named according to their attachment on that fibrous ring. So the pulmonary valve has an anterior, a right and a left cusp, whilst the aortic valve has a posterior, right and left cusp. These valves do not have chordae tendineae attaching to them. Once the ventricles have contracted and the blood is forced through either the 2 semilunar valves, the elastic recoil of the aorta and pulmonary trunk pushes blood back towards the heart, and this closes the cusps of the pulmonary and aortic valves, causing blood to collect in the dilations that lie behind these cusps, and these are called sinuses. I just want to mention 2 of these sinuses, the right and left aortic sinus, which are located behind the left and right cusps of the aortic valves, as these contain the openings for the left and right coronary arteries. When the blood is ejected from the left ventricle, the cusps of the aortic valve open and block the openings of the 2 coronary arteries. This means the coronary arteries only fill with blood during diastole, when the ventricles are relaxed and the elastic recoil pushes the blood back into the sinuses. So in this podcast, we've looked at the general features of the heart, including its external surface, and detailed the major structures within its 4 chambers. In the next podcast of the Thorax series, which is number 7, I'm going to detail the coronary circulation,